series. My name is Leah Palagashvili, and I'm the director of the SFL webinar series and an executive board member of SFL. We are honored to have Matt Pritchard deliver a talk tonight on Building a New Frontier, how ocean cities can revolutionize politics. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty in the webinar series. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization run by students and for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed 4 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche in our universities, connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty, organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on running a student organization, tabling kits, leadership training, an academic journal for liberty and society, and our bread and butter conferences. The SFL webinar series is our way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorship in liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars each week to put you in touch with the top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country. For a full list, please visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. Tonight's webinar is with Matt Pritchard. Matt is a volunteer ambassador for the Seasteading Institute. After finishing his undergraduate studies in theater arts at St. Martin's University, he moved to New York City, where he currently spends his time pursuing his acting career and building his photography business. He has spent the last several years of his life independently studying economics with a focus on the Austrian school, anarcho-capitalism, and more recently, public choice theory. Matt has also studied the economics and history of incarceration through the Mises Academy under Professor Dan D'Amico. Just to note, there will be about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type in any questions into the question box. For those interested, this webinar will be recorded and archived on our website in the next few days. We will be sending you more detailed information about Students for Liberty and our upcoming webinars in the follow-up email. Without further ado, I present to you Matt.
Hi everyone, my name is Matt, and I really just want to start off by thanking Students for Liberty for allowing me to have this webinar. I am extremely excited about it, and I love talking about these ideas. So I'm going to start off with a little overview of my talk, if my PowerPoint will work. There we go. So in the first section, I want to talk about what the Seasteading Institute actually is, and if you're not familiar with the idea of seasteading, what that is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of competitive government and how we view rules as technology, and then answer the very important questions of whether or not this is science fiction and when we can move. The second part, which I think is going to be kind of the most important, or I guess kind of the meat of the talk, is I'm going to talk about current libertarian tactics for social change and how it's based on this idea of folk activism and why that can't possibly work. I will talk briefly about how democracy is kind of rigged against libertarianism, and then present how seasteading addresses and fixes these failures. And then the last part is actually going to be, I think, the most important, and this is how you can directly contribute to making this vision a reality, and making it a reality very, very soon. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. The Seasteading Institute is a nonprofit organization that was founded by Pritchard Friedman in 2008. Many of you may know Pritchard Friedman is actually Milton Friedman's grandson. He was the Nobel Prize-winning economist. And Pritchard used to be a Google engineer, and he quit his job to basically make free societies, to pursue that as his full-time job. He currently stepped down from the Institute as the president. Our current president of the Seasteading Institute is Michael Keenan, and Pritchard is still, I believe, on the board of directors and is kind of the public face of seasteading, but he's moved on a little bit. He started a for-profit company called Future Cities Development Incorporated, and its focus is right now building a completely new legal system from the ground up for a charter city in Honduras. And if you guys want to ask me a little bit about that kind of extra thing about Pritchard later on, then feel free to do so, but I want to kind of keep focused on what is happening now with the Institute itself. Now, the initial financial backing for the Institute came from PayPal founder and early Facebook investor Peter Thiel. He's kind of a libertarian superhero, in my opinion. And if you were at the International Students for Liberty Conference in DC a couple of weeks ago, you had the extreme pleasure and fortune to have actually heard him speak, hear him speak. It was very inspiring, and we are very, very grateful for Peter Thiel's generosity and interest in this idea. He's really been vital to the success of the Institute so far. So, what is seasteading? Or actually, what is the Institute's purpose? I'm going to talk about what seasteads are. That's this thing right here in the picture. Talk about that in a minute. The Seasteading Institute is a nonprofit organization. They have no intent of ever actually launching a seastead or building a seastead at any point. The idea is to actually help others and enable them to create seasteads. We do this by trying to build a movement of seasteaders, by communicating the idea to people so they first of all know about it. We do this, I mean, primarily like what I'm doing right now through the webinar. There's been lots of media coverage of the Institute. And there's also some non-traditional ways in which the Institute promotes the idea. There's a festival that they have every year on the Sacramento River Delta called Ephemerile. It's kind of the Burning Man on the water. It's supposed to be a blast. I haven't had a chance to go myself, but it's supposed to be a great time where you can meet a lot of really, really interesting people and live in a different kind of social organization for a couple of days. So there's that, and there's also the annual conference that the Seasteading Institute holds. I actually don't think they had one last year, but there will be one in 2012 in June, and I'm going to have more information about that at the end of the talk. Registration is open for that, by the way. The other part of it is we try to connect investors and entrepreneurs who are interested in seasteading, connect them with each other so they can actually build these things and make it a reality. And the most important part, and what we have been working on basically since the beginning in 2008, is compiling a library of research for these entrepreneurs. So when they go to make their seastead, they don't have to answer a lot of the initial questions, the basic questions like, okay, what are some of the most basic engineering challenges? What types of seasteads are actually economically feasible? What are the legal barriers to doing this? What does it take to get international recognition? Things along those lines. And we're still working on that, and it's an extremely important part of the mission of the Institute. So now I've explained what the Institute is, let's talk about what seasteading actually is. Seasteads are going to be floating cities or micronations that will be built on semi-submersible platforms or other kind of ocean vessels that will reside outside the territorial waters of current nation states. Now, you can see this one. This is actually a render of a research project that was commissioned by the Institute itself. It's called Clubstead, and this is actually a dwelling that can hold about 250 to 300 people and live comfortably with office spaces for work and jobs. And this actually could exist out 200 miles off the coast of any nation. This was part of a feasibility study. They found that it is actually, the engineering aspect of it is possible and very doable, and that it is actually economical to do it as well. It looked like somewhere between $300 and $400 per square foot was the price of real estate on this platform, which is actually not that far off the mark from places like San Francisco and New York. So this is technology that is economically feasible right now as we speak, and over time the cost could come down enormously if the idea takes off. Now, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, hopefully. This seastead actually has these cement columns supporting it, and that's exactly the same technology that oil rigs use. This is technology that is available off the shelf right now. The columns are actually hollow, full of, it's like got a big air pocket in it, but you can pump more or less water into it. So if you are experiencing a large storm, the platform actually raises up out of the higher up above the water or lower, so you can avoid some of the many ocean hazards out there. Now, the point of actually going out and building these things in the first place is that it puts you beyond the territorial jurisdictions of existing governments and allows you to experiment with new forms of government. And it allows you to do it peacefully. You don't have to start a war, have a revolution, win an election, anything along those lines. If you have an idea for a new kind of government that nobody's ever tried, or just an improved version of your own government, you can go out and try it and no one will stop you. Or at least that's the theory. Seasteading, it effectively actually establishes a new and permanent frontier. For about 99% of human history, whatever nation states and civilizations we had were surrounded by massive, unclaimed frontier territories. Whenever governments became too oppressive, or if people simply wanted to escape civilization and start out on their own, they had the option to do so. That isn't really possible anymore. Every piece of land on Earth, down to the smallest island, is claimed and defended by a nation state, and they do not allow for political experimentation within their borders. I mean, that's kind of the point of having their borders, is they get complete control within those countries. So, is this science fiction? It kind of sounds like it. It sounds, I mean, building gigantic cities on ocean platforms sounds very difficult and very expensive, which it is, but it's not that out of the realm of possibility. If you look at this, this is actually, these two things are to scale. So this is a 1-to-1 size ratio. This is the Empire State Building right here, and this is a cruise ship. This thing moves all the time, all around the world. It holds thousands of people. It imports all of its goods, all of its fuel. It doesn't produce anything, and it makes millions of dollars every single year. Every year, more than 30 million people live on cruise ships and oil rigs. And while it is a temporary solution, there is no reason that dwellings on things like cruise ships and barges and oil rig style platforms couldn't be made to have more permanent living situations. It's not necessary for these things to be self-sustaining. It would be interesting. There have been some interesting concept designs where seasteads have their own power generation and things along those lines. But in the near term, it's not necessary. And being libertarians, I think we can all appreciate the value of free trade. You don't actually have to have resources to make this a success. And in the near term, this is also, I'm going to try and answer the question of when can we move and how long is this going to actually take. The first seastead is actually going to be launched in Q3 of 2013. It's called Blue Seed, and it's going to be on a cruise ship or barge retrofitted to house about 1,000 people permanently with large office spaces. It's going to be a tech startup incubator off the coast of San Francisco, off the coast by about 12 miles, and it'll serve to circumvent immigration restrictions legally. It'll allow people from all around the world, brilliant entrepreneurs who can't secure a work visa to come into the United States, to live on the ocean liner and be close enough to make contact with, make regular contact with investors and other talent from Silicon Valley. And it's a way that they can build their companies, and when they scale sufficiently, they can actually get sponsored by corporations and get visas and move on to land. So we can get all of the most brilliant people in the world who are trying to come to Silicon Valley to create value, make the next Google, and really push humanity forward. This is a way of circumventing the political problem with an entrepreneurial solution. So that's kind of the idea behind seasteading in the near term. In the later term, we'd like to see actual colonies and villages and societies living on much larger dwellings and more permanent situations on the ocean. So why go to the ocean, and isn't this utopian fantasy? So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but every piece of land is claimed and defended by an existing nation. And even moving just 12 miles off the coast of a nation puts you right outside the territorial waters of a current existing nation. You get an incredible boost in autonomy. And another aspect of this is that the ocean itself is a vast, untapped resource that can be used to improve the lives of millions of people. Right now, the ocean is essentially a gigantic commons, and we get things like resource depletion and whatnot because of that. If you can actually establish nation-states with territorial boundaries within the ocean, opportunities for things like aquaculture and fish farming or growing algae for biofuel or food becomes very, very viable and actually helps to create more resources instead of simply overfishing them and depleting them and whatnot. And I'm sure this is actually an area I don't have much experience with, so I'm sure there's lots of other things that the ocean has to offer as well. So that's another advantage of seasteading. Now notice I actually haven't said anything specifically about libertarianism yet. And that's because seasteading really isn't about libertarianism per se. It can definitely benefit libertarians, but it's a politically agnostic idea. This is big tent. I mean, this is such a big tent that even the communists and socialists can be excited about this. If they're not happy with the way that things are being run, they can actually go out and have create their society the way that they want to, as long as it's voluntary. I'm okay with that, and try it out and see if it works. And this thing actually ends up being kind of what we call a meta-libertarian adventure, I guess you would say. It's that this kind of brings it up to a bigger level, where even if you have completely different political ideologies that aren't libertarian in any way, going out and creating seasteads, they're still having to solve the legal and engineering problems that we are. That brings the cost of the technology down. And it actually, to have citizens, they have to go out and compete for citizens. For people to want to live there, they have to create an environment that will actually attract people to come live there. This puts competitive pressure on governments to be better. So you get actual competition, kind of like market competition, between different seasteads and different firms. And this is why we kind of look at government as a technology. Rules themselves are a good, like a consumer good. They serve a function to consumers. Now this may sound a little counterintuitive at first, because we're used to thinking about goods as like, you know, I buy a computer, or I go to the bookstore and I buy a book, or an e-reader now. I guess nobody reads books anymore. Or I go to the grocery store and I buy food, and those are consumers' goods, and I consume them. But that's not exactly the case. Murray Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State actually states it this way. It says, this consumer's good may be a material object like bread, or an immaterial one like friendship. Its important quality is not whether it is material or not, but whether it is valued by man as a means of satisfying his wants. Under this definition, rules definitely fit. The purpose of rules is to facilitate social cooperation, and to that end we can actually distinguish between rules that do that and rules that don't, good rules and bad rules. Rules serve as this kind of social technology that, if we look at it from the perspective as a rule being a good, through the market process, goods can, the quality of goods can increase enormously over time. And the quality of our rules and our governments can actually get much better by subjecting those organizations to competitive pressures. And we look at rules as kind of the most important thing in society. They are the key to the success or failure of every single society. How rules and property is administered determines almost every aspect of any given civilization. Oh, really, you say? Yes. Absolutely. It actually matters more than having natural resources. It matters more than like cultural norms, more than the capital you've accumulated. It matters really more than anything. And here's an example of why this is the truth. This is a picture of Korea at night. Now, this is a place it's a relatively small territory, started with precisely the same resources, same natural resources, on a very deep level. These people had the exact same cultural norms, the exact same laws, they spoke the same language, everything. And they started off with precisely the same amount of wealth distribution. Now, due to an accident of history, one part of this country ended up with horrific communism, and it's a very bad set of rules. They got a bad government technology, and one got a much more advanced, superior set of rules. This is North Korea. It's like this black hole. It's like sucking in the light and electricity from everywhere else, whereas South Korea is probably one of the most technologically advanced civilizations on the planet. And you can see that just from the city lights. We have this tiny little light. I think that's probably Kim Jong-il's house. But this literally comes down only to having a different set of rules, and that's it. Another example, why resources don't matter at all. This is a picture of the Hong Kong skyline. Hong Kong was, in 1945, a rock. It was a small British trading outpost that at the end of during World War II, when Chinese communism was essentially like sweeping across everything, they stopped at the border of Hong Kong and left it alone for some reason. Millions of refugees, wounded war veterans who made their way there, piled onto this this rundown tiny little city, built just where all these buildings are, were shanty towns everywhere, and through this wonderful accident of history, the communists stopped. They didn't come and take this place over and subject it to their awful, awful rule. They also had the good fortune of being administered by a British officer named John Copperthwaite, and this man is probably one of the greatest libertarian heroes, I think, of the 20th century or ever. He was a hardcore libertarian who wouldn't even collect things like GDP statistics on Hong Kong. It had the lowest tax rates basically in the world, and within 15 to 20 years, Hong Kong enjoyed a higher standard of living than Italy. This place does not have enough potable drinking water on its own to supply even half its population to keep them alive. The reason that Hong Kong is one of the highest, has like the highest per capita income in the world, or comparatively, is because of its rule set. It has had unprecedented economic freedom. It has little political freedom at the moment, but its economic freedom is almost completely unsurpassed. And that has everything to do with its rules that allowed for spontaneous order and nothing to do with the amount of resources it had. So again, looking at this from the perspective of government as a technology, as a good that can be improved, it opens up a new way of looking at things. Now, I hope you can see this clearly. It's a picture of an old boombox with 2 tape decks in it. And this is, if you see, it says magic, like this is some incredible product. Oh my God, it tapes tapes. This thing can record music from one onto another. I mean, doesn't that just blow your mind how advanced that is? No, of course not. This thing is like 20, 25 years old, and it looks like it's from the Stone Age. To think that we would still be playing music on one of these things in this day and age it's mind-boggling to think that. Our consumer products get better year after year after year. Our governments do not, and that's because they are not subjected to any kind of competitive pressure. There is no frontier where we can go out and force them to change their behavior or lose their customers. And this also brings up another question of, like, WTF, how are we still using the same government technology from 200 years ago? I mean, can you imagine using the same music playing devices that George Washington was using? The idea is absurd, and it should be absurd. I mean, even the iPod, the original iPod, looks like it's from the Stone Age now. And I expect 200 years from now, they will laugh at how simplistic the iPad looks and devices of that nature. Things should get better. This also opens up the question of what is the best form of government. Now, I'm a libertarian. I'm about as libertarian as you come. I think I have some ideas as to what the best form of government is, but we really can't know before we try them out. And this is a famous quote attributed to Winston Churchill. I don't actually know if it is his saying, but he said, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Now, for most people, this is kind of the end of the story, and it shouldn't be. It should be the beginning of the story. The Constitution of the United States, as far as I can see, is one of the best government model documents ever drafted. However, that should not be the end of the story. We should try to continue to improve this, and we should recognize that there is vast room for improvement on it. And this kind of asks the question, if government is a technology, if it is a good, how can we possibly know what the best thing is beforehand? And like I said, we really can't. It's like, what is the best kind of shoe? What is the best novel that can be written? What is the best any consumer's good? And you really don't. We can't answer that question. We can say, though, that the market process is the best process at discovering which of those products is the best, and it should be no different for rules, technology, and government. We need a market process to discover which government is suitable for everyone's tastes and preferences. So if we're looking at this from the perspective of technology, what does this mean for libertarians? It really means that libertarians have been going about trying to change the world in a very, very seriously flawed way, and we need to shift our direction. We've done the economics of communism and socialism, we've got development economics, people have even written economics on marriage and things like that, social relationships. What we have been neglecting is applying our economic reasoning to political activism. And that's what we're going to do very briefly here. So what does the current libertarian strategy for social change look like? And I would say that it looks roughly something like this. Step 1, learn economics and philosophy. Step 2, argue about economics and philosophy with non-libertarians and call them statists when they don't agree with us. Step 3, Step 4, we're now free. We have a free society because of these 3 steps that we have done. Obviously, we need to answer what question 3 is. And this is obviously kind of oversimplified, but when it boils down to it, I don't think that this is very far off the mark. And this brings me to folk activism, which has essentially been the libertarian strategy. Folk activism is this kind of intuitive strategy that almost all humans use to try and influence society. It's really likely rooted in our biology and is kind of a holdover from our species days as hunter-gatherers. It's a social strategy really for a world that doesn't exist anymore. It seems like we grew up in civilization, and this is all very normal for us, but in the grand scheme of human history, civilization is an incredibly new thing and requires different tools and different strategies to effect change. So it's premised on the idea that our interpersonal interactions have an immediate and tangible effect on society, that when in fact human civilization has become too vast and complex, and this can't really work. It's like we think we can directly influence the actions of others by going up to them and simply being right and trying to convince them to change their behavior. But I really do think that in Pritchard Friedman's essay, Beyond Folk Activism, that he says it best with this quote here. In early human tribes, there were few enough people in each social structure such that anyone could change policy. If you didn't like how the buffalo meat got divvied up, you could propose an alternative, build a coalition around it, and actually make it happen. Success required the agreement of tens of allies, yet those same instincts now drive our actions when success requires the agreement of tens of millions. When we read in the evening paper that we're footing the bill for another bailout, we react by complaining to our friends, suggesting alternatives, and trying to build coalitions for reform. This primal behavior is as good a guide for how to effectively reform modern political systems as our instinctive taste for sugar and fat is for how to eat nutritiously. And this brings us kind of to the question of why doesn't this work? And this is obviously a big question, and I don't really have much time to go into it because there's an entire school of economics basically geared to explaining why this won't work. It's called public choice. Some of you in the audience actually probably know quite a bit more about it than I do. But I'm just going to focus on one aspect of public choice called rational ignorance for the moment. And this is asking the question of, like, why don't people actually learn about politics and economics if it matters and matters to society so much and matters to the development of civilization? And you have to kind of think of this from the perspective of the voter. And most people will openly tell you that they know their vote doesn't really matter because it's never going to come down to one vote. Your contribution to organizing your political party or whatever is so marginal that if you don't do it, if you don't actually vote, you haven't affected the outcome. If you do vote, you haven't affected the outcome. So what's really the point of trying to spend all this time and energy learning economics and philosophy? if people can't affect the outcome, and the benefits of that stem from electoral politics rarely make a large enough impact on their lives, people have no incentive to learn about politics and economics. The opportunity cost for doing so is enormous. I mean, as a student, you have a lot of time to spend learning philosophy and economics. Many of you are probably specifically studying that as your major. But put yourself in the place of just a working family. So, both parents are working. One of them might actually be taking night classes. They have kids to take care of. They have to help them with their schoolwork, things like that. And you're asking them to read Human Action or some economics text so that they can maybe have an influence on a politician's votes. And the opportunity cost of doing that is so massive. Why would you do that? In this sense, it's actually rational for them to remain ignorant. Now, this is a big problem. You can't, no matter how much you go up to someone and shake them and try to to educate them and change their mind about, you know, what is the definition of rights and how do economies work, if you can't overcome this incentive, they're not going to want to learn anyway. But what we're going to find out in the next bit is that although this is bad, the reality of the situation is so much worse than this. So it's time to get depressed. What you need to do is run to your nearest bookstore or online book vendor and pick up a copy of Bryan Caplan's book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. It is excellent. It is extremely entertaining. It is extremely informative, well argued. Bryan Caplan is one of the smartest people I've met in my entire life, and he's extremely convincing. And what the case that he makes in this book is that there is a mountain of empirical evidence that has been ignored that shows that most people are just biased against libertarianism. They are hostile to the ideas of economic freedom, of liberty, and basically anything associated with our political program. Now, there's a couple of explanations for this. The first is that there's been a lot of work done in social psychology recently using like the fMRI to peek inside some people's brains. You can ask them questions and see which parts of their brains are lighting up and whatnot. It's fascinating. But most people we're finding actually have just kind of an inborn intuitive moral compass. And they then use logic to justify their moral beliefs after the fact. They don't start from the position of logic and try to find out what is the correct morality or what is the correct economics, is that they start with their conclusion and then try to use reason to justify their conclusion that they've already come to. This is impossible to overcome, in my opinion. And I've seen these things where they're actually talking. They ask someone a question: "What is your position on the morality on X moral position?" And well, first they start off with like complex logical chains of reasoning that they make these people go through, like answering math problems, things like this. And they see which parts of the brain are lighting up for logical, complex chains of reasoning. And then they ask them, what is your moral position on this? And this kind of emotional center lights up and says, this is what my moral position is. Now they ask them, why do you have that position? And what should be happening is that the logical side of their brain is activating and they're using complex reasoning, but that doesn't happen. It's the emotional center lights up and is basically forcing itself over the logical arguments. This is very bad for libertarians because most people are not libertarians. And the fact that we are coming to know so many, like I've met so many libertarians recently, it's been great, but it's the fact that I think we're all just kind of intuitively finding this libertarian morality and meeting each other. It's not that more people are becoming libertarians, it's that just certain libertarians are finding out that they are intuitively libertarian. The second explanation is Bryan Caplan's, which is incredible and I think should have been obvious to everyone, but it takes someone to point it out, I guess, is that people actively avoid the truth, and this is what he calls rational irrationality. And this is in the public choice tradition of applying basic economic reasoning in ways that we're not quite used to. So Brian Kaplan brings up the point that people are very smart as consumers, but very systematically stupid as voters. They choose the wrong policies almost every single time. And this comes down to the fact that when deciding whether or not to buy a product, consumers weigh the costs and benefits of doing so. They have prices to kind of guide their decision making. When prices are higher, like when trade-offs become larger, people demand less of a good. And when the price is lower, they will demand and consume more of a good. Now, it's important to remember what Rothbard said about goods earlier. Goods can be immaterial. They don't have to be tangible things. And what we're discovering is that these worldviews, these intuitive moral senses that we have, are goods. They function like a mental security blanket for us. And people don't like it when you challenge those mental security blanket assumptions. And people who are biased against freedom, which is really terribly, it's almost everyone, and there is a lot of empirical evidence that doesn't just suggest this, it explicitly states this. Almost everyone hates freedom. People are basically purchasing and consuming a good when they engage in their own stupidity. When they reject economics, when they reject any kind of moral outlook or like correct moral reasoning, they're consuming a good. This good is called irrationality. So when Brian Kaplan talks about things like patriotism, anti-foreign bias, where it's like, oh well, our economy's doing bad and China's responsible because they're manipulating their currency. That's anti-foreign bias. Make-work bias is, people actually like the sound of Keynesian make-work policies. They think that, oh yeah, well if you just pay people to have jobs, then the economy will be good. They have these biases, and they're huge. Every other type of anti-liberty bias that people have, and it's not just limited to politics and economics, there's a number of other fields that have systematic bias as well. It serves a function of the consumer when they do this. It's like when someone roots for a sports team. It doesn't actually make the team do better, but it's a lot of fun and it makes the sports fan feel good. Nobody thinks that when they're cheering, they are actually causing the team to win the game. And there's really no price associated with this. You can do this all you want because, there's nothing that you have to forgo in order to do it. And it's exactly the same in democracy. Political parties are like sports teams. Your vote doesn't really affect whether or not they win. But boy, oh boy, does it feel good to cheer for your team. And now it's time for a graph. And this graph is going to show why we can't ever possibly hope to convince the majority of people of our positions. Folk activism will not ever accomplish that. So this is just your simple demand schedule. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. We have on the y-axis price, and we start at 0 right here and go higher and higher. And on the x-axis, we have quantity demanded. Now, for the sake of this section, the quantity demanded, what we're actually demanding here is irrationality or stupidity or whatever you want to call it. And the price is essentially what you have to forego or how much you have to give up in order to engage in irrationality. We don't know, we can't really say much about the shape of individual demand curves except that they slope downward. But what this does tell us is that if the price is really high, like up here, if we get to the highest point, you get to a point where the price of being stupid is too high, and people won't do it. They will actually employ reason and see the light and do the right thing. Now, when the price is 0 down here, you go over here, and the lower and lower that the price gets, the more and more stupidity people demand. The more and more irrational they become. And when the price is 0, they will consume the maximum quantity or maximum degree of irrationality that they possibly can. Stupidity is incredibly cheap in democracy. And this is a very, very bad thing for libertarians because our arguments depend on very lengthy, complex chains of logical reasoning, and when there's nothing incentivizing people to do that, they will just indulge in their personal biases. And so when people choose bad policies in democracy, they don't bear the cost individually. The cost of their stupidity is distributed across all of society. They make a bad decision and everyone is affected. And this is essentially the classic problem known as the tragedy of the commons. And democracy and ideology in this case is the commons. We have a situation, I don't know, many of you are probably familiar with the tragedy of the commons. If not, I'll explain it now. You have a bunch of different ranchers, and you have one big piece of land that you say, okay, you all own this, you all get to share it. And nobody can use fences or anything to cordon it off and have private property. Now what happens is that everyone has an incentive to use as much of the land as they possibly can for fear that everyone else will use it first. And so the cattle completely overgraze the land, destroy it, the cattle then starve to death, and the farmers go out of business. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And the great thing is that libertarians have a wonderful answer to this problem, and that is to privatize the land, to actually make it excludable and allow people to accept the benefits and costs of their actions and internalize those instead of externalizing them onto everyone else. This is exactly what's happening in democracy, and this points out an easy solution. We just need to privatize freedom. And a big part of this is that incentives matter so much. This is a quote from The Myth of the Rational Voter that Brian Kaplan says, one interesting prediction of rational irrationality is that fluctuating incentives make people bounce between contradictory viewpoints. They'll actually change their mind depending on what the incentives are, not depending on your argument. As a consumer, for instance, the protectionist usually casts bad economic theory aside. Suddenly, products' price and quality become more important, and national origin is lucky to have any influence. Similarly, most people reject the view that pushing up wages increases unemployment. When I teach intro econ, linking unemployment and excessive wages frequently elicits not only students' disbelief, but anger. How could I be so callous? But irrationality about labor demand is selective. What happens when my outraged students reach the salary requirements line on a job application? They could ask for $1 million a year, but they don't. When their future rides on it, students honor the economic truism that labor demands slope downward. And this is the exact same thing with governments. So what the solution is that we have a very simple answer to a very difficult problem. And the answer to our activism woes have been right under our noses the entire time. And all we need to do is act on it. It's time to stop arguing about which society is the best and trying to, it's like we're walking around the commons saying, hey, you shouldn't consume so much of the land because then everybody's going to be, because then all your cattle are going to starve and everyone's going to go out of business. Because that doesn't change the incentive. That's what the libertarian strategy has been doing. We've been trying to convince people to change their minds about what the right kind of government is, but we have not changed the incentive structure. Seasteads offer a material incentive for people to make informed choices about government policy, and will put competitive pressure on existing governments to liberalize their policies. And I mean, this actually is an incredible solution because you don't even have to change people's minds. If you offer them a better place to live, a much radically better government, you just offer that to them. You build it and they will come. People's minds will change basically automatically. If you create an amazing place to live, people will seek the opportunities that you have made. So seasteading effectively privatizes the commons in ideology and in democratic decision-making. It puts a real material price on the consumption of irrationality and stupidity. Now, material incentives change people's behavior and even change their minds. It's like if you were to take a Soviet citizen, and this actually happened quite a bit, when Soviet citizens would come and visit the United States, they would have this all of the Soviet propaganda in their minds. But once they got here and saw what the United States and freedom was actually like, it almost unanimously would overcome decades of state propaganda. If we can create free societies on the ocean and show people freedom, if we can make new Singapore and new Hong Kong and replicate their success, where debate fails, the incentives will succeed. So now we're getting to the most important part, and this is how can you help? Now, where you're going to have the most information is if you go to www.seasteading.org/students, and this is going to have a breakdown on all the stuff that I'm going to talk about. We have a number of research fellowships available through the Institute. If your university or institution has an independent study program, they will tailor-make a internship for you, and you can actually get college credit for solving research problems for seasteading. And these are like tangible problems that need to be solved for seasteads to actually become real. So not only are you helping fix the world, but you're getting wonderful things to put on your resume and your college transcript. And like I said, this is like you're directly aiding to making this a real thing. So what are the research topics? This is just some of them. It's not limited to these. And if you actually come up with and think of other research topics that might that you think we're kind of missing here, then please contact the Seasteading Institute and give them a proposal, and they'll work with you on it. One of the big ones is data transmission. How do you get reliable, high-speed internet 12 to 200 miles off the coast? And how do you do that cost effectively? This is a big one. Alternative energy. One of the things is we want to try and minimize the amount of environmental impact that we do, that we create. And this is actually a kind of a twofold strategy. One is that we just really don't think that you should pollute and do things like that and mess up people's property and territory. But the other thing is it also really increases your chances of having a good relationship with nearby nations. If you're not polluting their waters, that's going to be a big plus. Another place is how do we actually identify where we should moor and place these seasteads? What are the best political environments? And what are, how do we avoid putting them on fault lines and volcanoes, underwater volcanoes, things of that nature? There are a lot of challenges in law and politics, and specifically, this is one of the big ones in the beginning, flag registration. Seasteads are actually going to have to fly the flag of some nation at first, at least to get international legal recognition. And this is what the cruise ship industry does. Many American-owned cruise ship companies actually operate the flag of like the Marshall Islands or the Bahamas because they have much lower taxes and much less restrictions on them. And they still operate within U.S. waters, and nobody, and the government doesn't try and invade them, nationalize them, anything of that nature. But there are distinct advantages and disadvantages to each country that offers a flag of convenience. And we'd like to compile enough information to be able to determine which ones will be the best for each different kind of business model. And also, what you can do is register for the Seasteading Conference in San Francisco. That's going to be May 31st to June 2nd. It's going to be awesome. We're actually having a thing called lightning rounds, where if you submit a proposal, you get a 5-minute slot to basically pitch your insane, awesome seasteading-related idea. Even if it's only tangentially related to seasteading, there will be entrepreneurs, investors, and really cool people there to hear you speak. And you'll also get to meet other seasteaders and entrepreneurs. And also, Ephemerisle is directly after this. So if you want to do Burning Man on the water, then this is a good way to start it off. But I think the single most important thing that you can do is to not limit yourself and consider entrepreneurship. Become an entrepreneur and launch a seastead. Build a new society. There are massive profit opportunities involved with seasteading, and it's going to take young, creative people to do this. And if you were at the International Students for Liberty conference a couple of weeks ago, Peter Thiel said some things that I found very personally inspiring, and that's that you shouldn't live an interchangeable life. That you should be extraordinary. And this is something I am increasingly attracted to, the idea of doing like medical tourism for seasteading. It's another way that we can come up with a an entrepreneurial solution to a political problem, and there's an enormous amount of money to be made in it. This is something that I think is probably the most important, is to make this a reality. This is not going to happen on its own, and we need more entrepreneurs doing this. So with that, I want to kind of open this back up to the moderators. And this is my contact information here. I'm an active, if you want to email me at any time, questions, anything, this is my email address, mattpritchard4@gmail.com. This is my Facebook page. And we only have a limited time for questions, but if there are more questions, I'm actually going to be having a blog TV at this address right here. So write that down. If you want to ask me more questions past the time limit here, I will stay up as long as you want talking about that stuff, because I can't talk about this enough. So at any rate, I'm just going to leave this slide here, so if people want my contact information, they can have it, and I will turn this back over to the mods.
Thank you so much, Matt. To all of our participants, please type in any questions into the question box. The question box is found on the GoToWebinar control panel, and I will be reading them off to Matt. And we have a first question already. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunities Blue Seed offers to entrepreneurs?
Yes, absolutely. Blue Seed, I think, is probably the most exciting, most ingenious business model I've heard of for seasteading yet. This vessel that they're going to be getting, they're not sure if it's going to be a cruise ship or a barge yet. It's going to have room for about 1,000 people on it, with about 200 staff members. It'll have like state-of-the-art workout facilities and entertainment centers, things like that, but also office spaces. And what they've found is that the best tech startup ideas kind of arose out of this college dorm type atmosphere. I mean, that's how Facebook was created, and a number of other big digital enterprises kind of sprang up out of that thing. So what they're doing is they're taking, in the United States, we educate people from all over the world. We take the best and brightest minds from places like India, places in Asia, really everywhere, bring them here to the best universities that we have, teach them everything, and when they graduate, we say, go start your company somewhere else. Get out, you dirty immigrant. And what Blue Seed is allowing us to do is really, the issue is getting an H-1B visa to work and live in the United States. The H-1 visa, it's either the H-1 or the H-B visa, it's the smaller one, is something that is actually very easy to get. And this is something they can get an H-1 visa, live on board, and they can spend, I think, up to 180 days in the United States without being penalized or anything like that. They can't get like a full-time job. They couldn't just pay rent on the ship and get a job in America. They actually have to be doing the majority of their work on the ship. The rent for these things is going to start probably around $1,200 to $1,300, so really it's comparable to Silicon Valley, and it'll go up from there. I mean, that's for like the basic apartment. But it's really not that out of the realm of possibility to get enough people to do this. They've done studies where they think that if the boat was actually moored right now, today, they'd have like 15 or 20 companies out there already. And this also actually allows for opportunities for tech startups from America to actually escape a lot of the early regulations that hamper innovation. If they can get on board Blue Seed, they're already dealing with an environment that has way fewer legal restrictions and will allow them to scale their business and actually find the money that they need to get it off the ground. So it's not actually just going to benefit people from other countries, but it is a way for getting skilled people from all around the world to come and build value in the United States.
Thank you, Matt. Our next question, how are seasteads able to gain international recognition, especially considering the significant difficulties of even established cultures, i.e. Palestine, and achieving that same recognition? If seasteads cannot achieve international recognition, how will they be able to significantly depart from the ideologies and jurisdictions of their native flag nations?
That is an excellent question. Well, the first part of it is that seasteading is kind of an incremental pragmatic strategy, and that we're starting small and not trying to immediately build a platform and say, we are a new country, you must recognize us. And what we do in the beginning, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but like the cruise ship industry flies a flag of convenience, and what we do in the beginning is do that. We have to start out with some kind of international recognition. We choose a place that has a stable legal system, that has something on offer. And as time goes on, this is actually one of the things that we need research into. And one of the reasons I'm giving this presentation, maybe you could look into this, is moving past a flag of convenience and actually making treaties with countries. And hopefully after having made treaties with more countries over the course of maybe like the next 10 or 20 years, Then, as things scale outward and these really do become large cities, they will seek international recognition through things like the United Nations. And admittedly, this is one of the big challenges that seasteading faces. But it's going to be expensive, it's going to be difficult, it's going to require a lot of research, but that's just the same as saying, you know, coming up with new medicine is difficult, takes a lot of research, and is going to be very expensive. It has a chance of success, whereas I think trying to convince people to change things on land is just automatically doomed to failure.
Okay, we have a follow-up question to that. Before we reach the international recognition, even if seasteading worked, would the government just immediately get rid of international waters and bring seasteading under the same purview as all other land?
It's a possibility, but the thing is, I don't think governments are going to even be paying much attention to these things at first. These are very small operations, and governments have a lot of things to deal with on their plate, especially like you look at the United States, we have wars, we have a crumbling economy, and as long as your business doesn't actually interfere directly with the sovereignty of your host nation, then there's not much of a reason for them to come after you and essentially nationalize you. So a great example that Pritchard Friedman shared with me was that you look at, like, the United States hates drugs and bans drugs in its own country and doesn't let people import drugs. And they do this because this is their own territory. They have sovereignty within these boundaries. Now, if you look at some place like Amsterdam, where you can smoke pot in coffee shops, the United States is not sending the military to Amsterdam to break into coffee shops and stop people from smoking pot. They don't really care about that. And I think it's kind of the same thing. The difference is, like, you look at South America, the United States does send its military into South America because they grow cocaine and manufacture methamphetamines and then bring it into the United States. They interfere directly with the territorial sovereignty of a nation. Excuse me, of a nation. And that is a way to attract a lot of bad attention. This is why intervention from states is, besides the actual technical challenges of the ocean, intervention from states is the biggest danger of doing this. But, like I said, it depends on your business model. Things like coming up with, like if you were to create biofuel and like new green technologies, or you know, help businesses get started in America through something like Blue Seed, they're not going to really want to interfere with that since they have something to gain from it. And it's also like if you look at oil rigs. Why doesn't the United States just nationalize all 1,500 oil rigs in its jurisdiction? And it's because, first of all, the government is made up of a lot of different competing interests. Not all of them have the exact, it's not one entity that is all-encompassing evil trying to destroy civilization. It's also, there's, people in the government do understand that nationalizing all the oil rigs would be a bad idea. Taxing something is better than taxing nothing. And if they take over the oil rigs, they know that basically the ability for them to be profitable is gone, and they've killed the goose that lays the golden egg. If you can create a business model that actually has something to offer people that they want, that they might not necessarily be able to get in their own country, but doesn't affect their legal system, then countries will actually compete to host you. If you can offer something really, really good to them, they might even offer you better deals, more autonomy, closer to land, things like that. So it really does come down to whether what your business model is. Things like human trafficking, drug trafficking, slavery, those are almost guaranteed to get war boats sent after you and shut down your operation. But offering like green tech and or medical services, cheap medical services, that's almost guaranteed, I think, to create a stable relationship with your host nation. And that's also, you want to pick a good host nation. It may be the case that the United States is not the best place to have seasteads off the coast. I don't know, we won't know until we try, but there are a lot of places around the world that I think would be much more amenable to this, like Singapore. I actually know someone, he actually might even be watching this right now, met him through YouTube. He's an entrepreneur, a fish farmer in Singapore, and is working on launching a seastead off in Southeast Asia. And their governments are much more friendly to free trade and things like that. So it's important to actually do a lot of planning and find out if where you're putting your business is going to put it in danger.
Okay, next question. Can seasteads affect the marine life?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the biggest things that we want to try and do is minimize the amount of environmental impact that we have. And this is another way, this kind of ties into the other question. If you're damaging the environment, if you're dumping barrels of oil onto baby seals and dumping nuclear waste down the mouths of the fish and killing the biology and things like that, that's going to attract a lot of negative attention. And again, it's going to depend upon what exactly your type of vessel you have, what kind of impact it'll have on the environment. But the goal is to, over time, move towards more sustainable green technologies like solar, wind, and wave-generated power. In the near term, things like generating electricity is going to have to be done through using diesel generators. Over time, we'd like to actually use much more advanced technologies like wave break generators and things like that. But that's going to be something that's hard to balance. And again, this is an area of research that we really need you guys. We really do need you guys for this to be a success. This is an area of research that needs attention, and it's going to need to be solved if these things are actually going to take off and be successful. So, if that is something that interests you, I suggest coming up with a proposal and contacting the Seasteading Institute. Remember, go to seasteading.org/students and do one of our research fellowships.
Okay, our next question. What sorts of currencies do you foresee the seasteads using?
That is a difficult question to answer. I would imagine in the near term, probably US dollars, just whatever is the most, whatever nation you're closest to is probably going to be the currency that you use. I would hope that over time gold currencies and competing currencies could be generated. That's actually something that might come about out of seasteading, but I think the future is just too uncertain to actually know that. I would hope we got a better monetary system, but for now I would say we'd probably be using some kind of state-run fiat currency, as awful as that sounds.
Okay, our next question. You mentioned that the Free State projects are trying to accomplish something similar. Would seasteads be hindering their progress or complementing their progress?
I definitely think complementing. I like the Free State project a lot. I actually have some friends who live in New Hampshire, and it is actually the same kind of strategy that seasteading is doing. It's a response to the failure of folk activism. So we can't convince enough people to change this place, so what we do is we go to New Hampshire and we basically swarm the vote. We get as many libertarians in one place as we can, and we change things that way. And they have gotten some increases in freedom in New Hampshire, but I think it's a pretty low-risk, low-reward option, because most of the major restrictions that libertarians are against, like the drug war, fiat currency, the really big issues, are enforced at a federal level. So they can do a lot at the state level with state laws, but the big issues still aren't very hard to touch. But I do think that this is something that would actually absolutely complement it. I mean, if you could put a seastead 12 miles off the coast of New Hampshire, I'm sure you're actually going to have a much better legal environment and friendly land population right next to you than you would, say, somewhere where I am in New York, where it's statist central. But yeah, I think it's complementary. I don't think that this would diminish their efforts at all.
Thank you, Matt. And I think we have time for one last question. What will seasteads do for national defense? Will they have private police?
That again is hard to answer because that depends on each individual seastead. I would like to see private police forces and private military type things. It is possible the farther that you get out from nations, and if we are actually able to scale these out to real cities like Hong Kong city-style nation states out in the open ocean, like 200 miles off the coast and farther, in true international waters, then it becomes much easier to actually develop things like ballistic missiles and get military technology that you could apply to them. But again, this comes down to each individual seastead, and that's at least a couple decades away. So I don't know. It's difficult. It's very difficult to say. But I would like, I would personally like to see private defense forces and private firms supplying these things and innovating in the issues of defense. I think that's something, again, if we look at rules and defense are goods, and they can be tied to this question of technology, and they can be made radically, radically better very, very quickly. But again, I think that's something that's a ways off, and it's going to be a tough road getting there. But if we can get there, then we can definitely change the world at that point.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, and to all of our participants this evening. We had a ton of questions at the end, and we apologize if we couldn't get to your question, but please feel free to continue the discussion with other participants in the chat room or the Facebook event, or as Matt mentioned, feel free to join his blog TV and also contact him as well. I hope you can all continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout this year. Next week, we have our first ever advanced academic webinar with James Audison. The webinar will begin at center around Professor Audison's paper on Markets and Order, the Contribution of the Scottish Enlightenment. We are limiting the discussion to 15 participants and have a very quick application process. I'm sending the link via the webinar control panel now and extending our application deadline until midnight tomorrow, so feel free to register as soon as possible. On a final note, shortly you will receive a follow-up email where you'll find more detailed information about SFL and our next webinar. You'll also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a couple minutes to fill it out. It helps us to know how to improve our web programs and makes these webinars more interesting for you. And with that, I think we are officially wrapped up.
Excellent.
Thank you again for your time this evening, and have a wonderful night.